So I want to tell you this story that Dr. Henry McLeod tells in, I think, his book about boundaries. And he talks about a friend of his named Dennis. And Dennis had 2 large businesses and 2 families and lost them both in sequence. Lost a business, lost a family, lost a business, lost a family. And I'm guessing you could figure out why. After each of these huge losses to his alcohol addiction, Dennis would build a new life, but he would be unable to sustain it. Binges, police interventions, drunken stupors often embarrassed Dennis and his families. This is par for the course. Many mornings he woke up in places he couldn't remember having driven to. One time that was his front lawn. His life was bleak and his friends had given up on him, and he had mostly given up on himself. And you know the reason I'm sharing this story with you is because Dennis is a different man today. He's an honest and successful businessman, a good husband, a loving father, a faithful friend, and he is welcome wherever he goes. And he has worked hard to clean up the messes he made. The evil, the demon even, if you like that kind of language, that is the disease of alcoholism, no longer controls his life. But it wasn't a magical, flash-in-the-pan religious experience. It was a religious experience, but it wasn't magical, and it sure wasn't a flash in the pan. His spiritual growth, his connection to God, has made it so that he's clean and sober for 3 decades now. But it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without him working at it. You have friends and neighbors and coworkers who have similar stories. You may not know it. Maybe you yourself have a similar story. And some of us have friends and family who have a story like this that took a darker, unhappy turn. Curious about how Dennis had made this turnaround after his early hopeless season, Dr. McLeod asked him, and Dennis said, well, it wasn't hard. I just went to 7 AA meetings a day. Not 7 AA meetings a week, 7 AA meetings a day. And most of us feel like if we work on our spiritual life 1 day a week, we're doing well, right? Dennis's recovery didn't just drop out of the sky. No spiritual journey grows by magic. It's a mystery, but it's not a puzzle. We know how it happens. God does God's part, we do our part. And the key to a successful spiritual life is knowing whose part is whose. What is your part, and what is God's part is God's part. But most of us get it backwards. We want God to do for us what we don't feel like doing for ourselves, or we can't figure out how to do for ourselves, but we want to do all the part that we really should be giving to God, right? There's a saying that many people have a relationship with God, mostly in an advisory capacity. Dennis's recovery didn't happen fast, and it didn't happen without him working hard. And it didn't happen without the love and strength and grace he found in a higher power. Lives wrecked by alcohol and drug addiction, or any addiction, gambling, food, sex, spending, make great stories because they illustrate for us in high relief this common human path of struggle. Most of us have stories that are similar, whether or not we have something as evil and as distressing as an addiction. Most of us have things in our lives that aren't very dramatic, but where we struggle and we can't quite figure out why God isn't helping us more. And very often it's because we have got the roles reversed. We're all seeking recovery. We want to recover the beautiful, whole, loving person we were before life got its hands on us, before circumstances beyond our control took us down a path, or whether our own stupid, ridiculous choices ruined our lives, or whether we were simply born into a situation that is unjust and unfair. We are seeking to heal the damage in our lives, to recover, and that is a work of God in partnership with us. Last week, as I shared with you from Genesis a little bit, we got to remember that God can do a new thing. The Bible calls this restoration. I like a new story. Getting a new story can help us. It takes work, spiritual work, to find the balance between what we must do and what only God can do. And if we get that equation wrong, nothing works. We have to find where we have to do our work and where we have to let God do God's work. And if we get that equation wrong, nothing works. Dennis, like a lot of folks who've struggled with addiction, had a lot of folks with well-intentioned advice for him during his drinking and destructive days. People would tell me to look on the bright side, Dennis will say. There wasn't one. They would tell me to just get a grip. Well, I would have if I could have, but I couldn't. More willpower was never the problem. I had willpower in all parts of my lives, but I couldn't conquer this. But the worst thing people told me, he said, was just give it to the Lord. Just give it to the Lord. I know they meant well, he says, and I prayed harder than you can imagine, but it was never enough. I felt like a total failure to God. How was I supposed to just give it to the Lord? I was happy to give it to the Lord. I sure didn't want it. But prayer never seemed to be enough. Reading my Bible, going to church didn't do it. I had to learn what was my part and do that, and to let God do God's part. And it took a while, and I needed help. Just give it to the Lord. That's one of those things that can make and keep Christians crazy. It's just terrible advice. It sounds good. It sounds like one of those things that ought to be true. You know, like a lot of bumper stickers. It sounds like it ought to be true, but it's a lie. And you know what part of that sentence is a lie? Just. The word just. As if learning how to turn over parts of your life to God and be responsible for the parts of life you need to be responsible for was easily done. Actually, any advice that starts with the word just ignore it. Now, as I mentioned last week, Genesis, the beginning of our Bible, starts by telling us about the creation of the cosmos and the place of humans in it. And then it moves on to talk about the people Israel, the people of the book. That would be our family story. And in Genesis 25, we discover the deep truth about some difficult things, like why humans are fighting with each other all the time. But we also learn a little something about just leave it to the Lord. As we read along, and I'm going to read just a little bit of it because there's actually about 3 chapters in this story. Listen for the ways that you hear God at work and the ways you hear humans at work. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. That sounds great. Just give it to the Lord. But if you read on a little later, you'll notice that Isaac is 40 when he marries Rebekah. He's 60 when the kids are born. He prayed for 20 years. 20 years. Okay, so y'all been praying for something for 6 months? You're great. You only have 19 and a half years to go, and it's going to work for you. So maybe there's a little something about persistence to be noted here. Persistence. And when you hear somebody say, just give it to the Lord, what's the implication? Hand it over, it'll get fixed. Persistence. In the meantime, Rebekah also consults the Lord by going to a prophet and is told that the younger will triumph over the older. This is God's intention, which is weird. It's out of sync. It's very countercultural for the younger child to lord it over the older child. But that's what happens. And then we hear this. But the children struggled together within her. Moms, right? In fact, her pregnancy was so hard, she says, if this is how it's going to be, why shall I live? This is so awful, shoot me now. And then we get a description of the babies. The oldest, Esau, is red and hairy, and Jacob comes out grabbing the heel of his brother, and the Bible tells us that the name Jacob means heel grabber. Heel grabber. And then we really get to see how this goes. Jacob and Esau are at it from the very beginning. In just a few verses, Esau sells his birthright to Jacob for some lentil soup. And it sounds a little bit like Jacob has tricked him into it, but if you look at it, Esau just doesn't seem to really care about his inheritance. And then in chapter 27, it gets even worse. Jacob tricks Isaac, their father, into giving him, Jacob, his father's blessing. Both of these things are really important in this culture. To get the inheritance is one thing. To get the father's blessing is another thing. To get the father's blessing, that makes you the patriarch of the family. So now Jacob has all of Esau's money, and he has Esau's position in the family. This does not make for happy families, does it? This does not make for happy families. And it's a really complicated story, and it has a lot to say, but I think there's something for us to notice here about the just give it to the Lord thing. First, I want to get this out of the way because I'm not going to preach about it. It's another whole sermon. I realized when I was writing this, I say that every time, don't I? That I got something else that's another whole sermon. I'm going to be preaching until I'm 111. It would be better, I think, if Jacob could be rewarded for outstanding behavior. It would be better in my world if this story was about how noble and excellent and wonderful Jacob was, and that's why God elevates him to be the leader of Israel. But it's not. That's not how it happens. Jacob and his mom lie, cheat, steal. But for our purposes today, ponder this. Among the many sociological, political, and theological things that this story has today to tell us today, let's notice this. We must take some action on our own behalf to receive what God means for us to have. I'm not real happy about the way Jacob and Rachel cooked this up, but it was in keeping with what Rachel had been told was going to be God's plan. We are unable to save ourselves, and we need active participation in the process of growth and change. This is why grace is at the heart of our faith. We need grace. Sincere believers turn to God as Savior, the one who gives them the abundant life, and then they ask God to heal their depression, take away their anxiety, deliver them from bankruptcy, save their marriage, and then they're disappointed, confused, and frustrated when God fails to deliver what God seems to have promised. And this comes from the mistaken idea bandied about by many well-intentioned Christians that our only job in life is to give it to the Lord. And here's why that is not just not helpful, it's harmful. It's a dangerous misreading of what's going on in the Bible. When we buy into this idea and then we find ourselves struggling, we're then stuck with the belief that, hey, I gave it to the Lord, it didn't get better. Conclusion, I'm a failure and God doesn't love me because my faith is too weak. And there are pulpits around the world today preaching that if you're not getting what you want, it's because God has failed you, because you have weak faith. And I am here to tell you it ain't so. My grandpa Arden after whom I am named, had Parkinson's disease, probably as a result of having contracted Spanish flu during the World War I kind of time. And by his mid-30s, he was no longer able to support his family, and my grandmother, luckily, had an executive secretary position at the University of Santa Clara. And my dad remembers being 7, 8, 9, and holding his dad's hand and walking to church after church, revival after revival, faith healer after faith healer, and he never received healing. He was told again and again and again, your faith isn't strong enough. Your faith isn't strong enough. You don't really believe, or God would have healed you. I don't need to tell you that my grandparents never darkened the door of a church again. I don't care how well-meaning this is, it is terrible to answer sorrow, misfortune, injustice, any of that with just give it to the Lord. Is someone really going to tell the 9-year-old girl in Bangkok being sexually trafficked to executives flying in their private jet just to be with her that she should give it to the Lord? Some stuff we have to take action on. Some stuff we have to take action on. And knowing what is our part, what is our footwork, and what is God's grace, the part God does, the part we can't do for ourselves, is essential. And the problem with this is it also leads to this troubling sense that if we just gave it to the Lord, I'd be perfect now. Well, I gave my troubles to the Lord. I decided I wasn't going to be such a gossip. So I gave that to the Lord, and next day I hear myself gossiping. I've flunked faith. Or worse, I can't stop thinking about other women, and I don't want to be unfaithful to my wife again. I gave it to the Lord, but the thoughts and the urges don't go away. I must be flunking faith. You ever have anybody get mad at you because you didn't do what they wanted you to do, and they said, well, I thought you were a Christian. Make a mistake, and somebody will say, well, I thought you were a Christian. It's really hard when we live with these silly ideas like just give it to the Lord and it'll all be fixed. Well, you wouldn't need to be here this morning, would you? You could give it to the Lord, you'd be perfect, we wouldn't even need the building. But most of you, between the last time you were here and today, something happened and you said, oh, I'm still not perfect. I guess I'll go get a dose of grace today and see if I can do a little better tomorrow. We have a part in partnership with God, day by day, choice by choice, stumbling step by stumbling step, and that is why grace is the center of our faith, not perfection. Grace is the center of our faith, not perfection. Finally, I want to say, and I really believe this strongly, won't surprise you, we cannot do this without one another. I believe in the church because I believe community is how God shows up for us. I had to make 3 phone calls yesterday to find someone who was home that I could talk to about a little struggle I was having. It wasn't a big struggle, but it was something I really just kind of needed to talk. I had to make 3 phone calls. And I finally got somebody. And they said just the right thing. That's how I gave it to the Lord. I said, my own thinking, not working too good here. Call some people who are smarter and wiser and more spiritual than I am, which is pretty much anybody in my phone book, and see what they have to say. And sure enough, the voice of God came through that woman last evening. Now, I'm not blind to the failings of churches. I just got through watching the 4-episode documentary about Hillsong. Don't do it. Just don't do it. But if you want to find flawed human beings, dysfunctional organizations, nastiness, pettiness, and outright evil, this is as good a place as any to find it. and a faith community, wherever you find it, whether it calls itself a church or not, is the place where you will make progress with your own healing as you work together with your brothers and sisters. So here's what we do. Here's what we do. We refrain from telling the mom whose son has just committed suicide to just give it to the Lord. We don't tell the man who has spent 18 months looking for a job in a recession to just give it to the Lord. Instead, we reach out with our hands and our hearts and we say, I don't have any good answers, but I love you. You're going through a hard time, and it's okay that you're sad or mad or confused or hurt or angry. I will hold you in my heart. I will walk with you in this hard time. We are, every one of us, wounded healers, able to love one another and walk with one another precisely because we have walked the path of human struggle. It's the only path to the life, the abundant life that God offers. And our willingness to work with God and receive what God can do alone is how we enjoy the life of abundance that Jesus spoke of. You know, don't tell us who God doesn't love. We know better.